They said the cemetery was closed to the public that morning, but grief has never cared about schedules. At the wrought iron gates of Arlington National Cemetery, where rows of white marble march up the green hills of Virginia like disciplined ghosts, an old man stood very still while the wind worried the flags to half-staff. His name was John Miller, 87 years carved into his hands and the soft lines around his eyes. He wore the only suit he owned, a dark, honest cloth, threadbare at the cuffs, but brushed clean as if neatness could be a final salute to a friend. "Is this some kind of joke?" the younger guard snapped. The word cut the cool air like a bayonet too sharp for a place built on silence and honor. He stood square in his dress blues, a human barricade with a nameplate that read, Jennings. Another guard drifted a step closer, smirking with borrowed confidence. "Private funeral. Invitation only. Show credentials or move along." John didn't look at either of them. He looked past where the hill crested and the white headstones broke the morning like teeth. Beyond the gate, the ceremonial caisson would be waiting, the horses restless, the riderless mount with its reversed boots, an ache all its own. Somewhere up that slope, a family was trying to steady itself for last goodbyes. John placed his palm on the cold iron, as if it were a friend's shoulder, and said in a voice worn smooth by time, "I'm here for the general. He would have wanted me here." The second guard, Davis, let out a humorless laugh that died fast, as if even he heard how small it sounded in that place. Black sedans with government plates began to nose up the lane windows, canted like mirrors that showed nothing back. People in quiet black stepped out one by one, officers, with the stiff sorrow of uniforms, civilians with grief in their hands. Heads turned, a few murmurs lifted and fell. That was how humiliation works, soft, public, and patient. Jennings stepped in close, the shine of his shoes biting into the gravel. "Look, Grandpa, the motorcade's arriving. You're creating a security problem. Public entrance is a mile down. If you want to visit a grave, you can walk." John didn't move. He had already done his walking in life through mud that clutched rain, that sliced nights that wouldn't end. He had learned how to wait without bleeding dignity into the dirt. He kept his hands by his sides and said nothing more, and the silence unsettled them because silence has a spine. A young lieutenant approached from the side checkpoint, putting on authority like a jacket, still too big across the shoulders. His tone was crisp, the cadence memorized. "Sir, you are disrupting a state funeral. This is the service for General David Wallace. You will vacate the area immediately." He didn't see John. He saw a problem to be solved before the arrival of more brass. John turned his head at last, just enough to meet the lieutenant's eyes. The old man's gaze had none of the brittle defiance that so often causes men with clipboards to harden. It held only a stark steadiness, the kind that makes noise go quiet. "Tell them John Miller is here," he said. "Names are small things until they're not." The lieutenant snorted. Young men are taught to defend procedure with laughter and flicked two gloved fingers at John's lapel. "No ribbons, no medals, no proof of service. As far as I'm concerned, you're a civilian trespassing on federal property." The gloved knuckle hit a pin no bigger than a dime oval, tarnished its surface misshapen, as if it had been hammered in a hurry by a hand that shook. It clung crookedly to the suit like a stubborn story no one had time to hear. The lieutenant's mouth curled. "What is that supposed to be, a prize from a cereal box?" John's hand rose halfway, as if to cover it, then fell. The pin was ugly, yes, but it had once burned hot enough to scar skin and bend time. The gesture cost him something. "Don't touch that," he said, mild and dangerous together. More cars slid to the curb doors, thumping closed with felted clicks. The hush around them tightened. Somewhere a bugler rehearsed a scale under his breath, soft, then softer. Inside the gate, a cluster of field-grade officers paused to watch. Grief is private, but disrespect is public, and the two had just collided on sacred ground. Jennings and Davis moved on cue, each taking an elbow. The old man's bones felt light beneath their grip like branches that had survived too many winters. The lieutenant's chin set. "Escort him away from the gate. If he resists, restrain him." John didn't resist. He wasn't built for spectacle. He took one half step because they wanted him to, and then another because he refused to be dragged. Gravel crackled. A woman in black turned her face aside as if she'd been slapped on his behalf. A colonel shook his head once, nearly imperceptible. then remembered what his rank required him not to do, and looked down at his shoes. A captain lingered near the back of the gathered crowd, hands folded behind him, watching with an unease that sharpened into something else. He had been overseas twice and learned to read men the way other people read maps. The old man's posture, the stillness in the storm, the quiet radius around him where arrogance would not settle was not rehearsed humility. It was the gravity of someone who had been to places that taught him what to carry and what to set down. The captain's name was Hayes. He understood that the wrong thing was happening in the right place, and that the right people would later pretend the wrong thing had been procedural. He understood, too, that he couldn't fix it with a barked order, but he could make a call. While the guards adjusted their grip for a firmer shepherding, irony prefers subtle entrances, Hayes stepped away, phone low, voice lower. The words he spoke were the quiet kind that turned tides, a name, an object, a possibility, just dangerous enough to make a career hitch. Back at the gate, the lieutenant basked in the false warmth of a small victory. He didn't hear the conversation ending 100 yards away, with a sucked-in breath that meant hurry. John's shoes scuffed once. He felt something hard underfoot, an acorn maybe. He was suddenly aware of everything, the way the flag halyards pinged against the poles in the breeze, the clean-cut smell of early grass, the tremor in Davis's hand when the young man swallowed and tightened his grip, as if fear of making a mistake could be strangled into certainty. He thought of another morning's air, heavy or wet with the steam of a jungle. He could hear rain somewhere. It wasn't raining. "I'm here for the general," he said again, more to the ground than to the men. The words were not a plea. They were a map folded along an old crease. A rumble rose on the road beyond the hill, low and official. Heads began to turn like flowers toward a sudden sun. Even Jennings's fingers loosened without his permission. Motorcade engines have a particular gravity, and these had it, the kind that makes men reassess which rules are about to apply. The sound rolled down the lane and settled at the gate in a long shadow. The lieutenant straightened his cover, smoothed his voice, and prepared the lecture he would deliver to the old man as they placed him in a waiting vehicle. He never got to speak it. Doors slammed in unison, and the air seemed to stand at attention. Rank has its own weather system. It arrived all at once. John lifted his eyes and understood in a single clean moment that something had finally recognized him in this place. He did not smile. He did not speak. He simply stood, the pin on his lapel, a small flawed star that knew exactly what it was. The lieutenant's order hung in the air like a cold verdict. "Escort him out. If he resists, cuff him." Jennings and Davis shifted, tightening their grip on John's arms. The crowd at the gate stirred, black coats and medals gleaming under a pale Virginia sun, whispers swelling like restless leaves. To them he was still just an old man, stubborn and misplaced. But then the young officer's eyes caught a glint on John's chest. A crooked, tarnished pin, no bigger than a dime, clung to the lapel of his worn suit. It wasn't military issue, no ribbons, no polish, no shine, just a jagged scrap of metal hammered into shape by a hand that had once trembled with exhaustion. The lieutenant sneered, leaned close, and flicked it with a finger. "What's this supposed to be, some toy from a Cracker Jack box?" The moment his glove brushed the pin, the air changed. To John, the cemetery dissolved. The marble headstones vanished, replaced by the choking green of a jungle half a world away. The scent of manicured grass turned into the sour stink of wet earth and gunpowder. He was no longer standing on gravel, but knee-deep in the sucking mud of Quang Tri Province, Vietnam, 1968. The rain had been coming down for days, a sheet of warm needles that blurred the tree line. A UH-1 Huey helicopter lay twisted in a clearing, smoke curling into the canopy. Inside were the broken cries of men who should have died hours ago, but hadn't. One of them, a young captain with blood soaking through his torn fatigues, was pinned under a collapsed banyan tree. His leg bent wrong, his voice raw. That captain's name was David Wallace. John had been younger then, but even in youth, his face carried the lines of someone who had seen too much. He was no officer, no polished soldier. He was the one who went where the map stopped, the one who refused to leave men behind. That night, under the relentless downpour, he crawled through enemy patrols to reach Wallace and his scattered men. The jungle was alive with gunfire and the metallic taste of fear, but John's hands did not falter. "Keep this," John Wallace had rasped, pressing a shard of shrapnel still hot from an exploded mortar into his palm. His hand shook, blood slicking his skin. It's not regulation. It's not official. But it means more than any medal they'll ever mint. It means you were there. It means you saved us. The memory shattered. The jungle dissolved. Arlington returned with its quiet grass and gathered mourners. The lieutenant still smirked oblivious, his finger still hovering near the crooked pin. But John's eyes now carried a fire that hadn't been there moments before. He pushed the hand away, not roughly, but with a weight that spoke of jungles, nights, and men who had depended on him. His voice was low, almost dangerous. "Don't touch that." The guards faltered. To them he was frail, yet in that instant his stillness felt heavier than their polished rifles. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Something had shifted, though they couldn't say what. Captain Hayes, still watching from a distance, felt the truth settle into his bones. He had seen this kind of silence before in men who had carried too much yet never spoke of it. He turned his back thumb, already moving over his phone. The name he spoke into the line was simple, almost casual. "Colonel Markinson, sir, there's an incident at the main gate. An elderly man's being detained." He gave his name as John Miller. On the other end of the call, silence fell. The kind of silence that could stop time. Colonel Markinson stood inside a command tent 100 yards from the ceremony. Papers and radios spread before him. At first his tone was clipped with annoyance. "Captain Hayes, we're 5 minutes from the procession. Security can handle an old man." But when Hayes added almost as an afterthought, "He's wearing a tarnished pin on his lapel, looks like a piece of shrapnel." Said his name was John Miller, everything changed. The line went silent. Not the silence of distraction, but the silence that swallows a man whole. Markinson's hand froze mid-motion, his breath caught. When he spoke again, his voice was no longer busy or impatient. It was urgent, raw. "Repeat that name." "John Miller, sir." The colonel didn't answer. He slammed the phone onto the table and dragged a trembling hand through his hair. A young major nearby stiffened at the sight. "Sir, is everything all right?" Markinson's eyes were sharp now, alive with recognition. He remembered a sealed letter resting in his desk drawer, General Wallace's final instructions. "If John Miller ever comes for me, give him whatever he asks. He is owed a debt this nation can never repay." The colonel spun toward the major. "Get me General Peters, now. I don't care if he's on the reviewing stand, get him off. Tell him Code Shepard is active." The major blinked. "Sir, that's not possible. Shepard is—" "Do as I said," Markinson barked, pacing like a caged animal. Outside, the ceremony's rhythm faltered. A bugler lowered his horn. A cluster of officers checked their watches, wondering why the procession hadn't begun. The weight of something unseen pressed down over Arlington. At the gate, the lieutenant basked in his small triumph. Jennings and Davis tightened their grip, dragging John Miller slowly toward a waiting security vehicle. The old man's shoulders slumped, not from defeat, but from the deep, weary sadness of being dismissed yet again. The lieutenant leaned close, his voice a smug whisper. "Last chance, old man. Walk away with your pride, what's left of it, or spend the rest of the funeral in a holding cell." He paused for effect, savoring the cruelty. "You're a danger to yourself, a public embarrassment." He didn't know the storm he had just summoned. The first warning was a low rumble on the road, a sound that didn't belong in the hushed stillness of a military funeral. Tires bit gravel, engines growled. Cresting the hill came a convoy of 3 black Chevrolet Suburbans, their tinted windows flashing sunlight like obsidian. They didn't move with the solemn pace of mourners. They moved with the speed of authority, of power that expected obedience. The convoy screeched to a halt just feet from the gate. Doors flew open in perfect unison, like a drill rehearsed countless times. But these weren't MPs in plain fatigues. They were senior officers in immaculate dress blues, chests heavy with ribbons that clinged softly as they moved. Colonel Markinson stepped out first, his jaw tight with fury, and then from the lead vehicle's rear door, a tall figure emerged, broad-shouldered, 4 silver stars gleaming against his shoulders. The air itself seemed to grow still, as though the cemetery held its breath. General Michael Peters had arrived. Jennings and Davis released John as if he had turned to fire in their hands. The lieutenant snapped to attention, dread creeping down his spine. But General Peters didn't look at him. His storm-gray eyes scanned the scene until they found the stooped figure in the threadbare suit. And then the general moved. He walked past the guards, past the lieutenant frozen in place, past the crowd of mourners who parted in silence. He stopped 3 feet from John Miller. The man who had commanded armies and advised presidents raised his right hand to his brow and gave a salute so sharp, so deliberate, it cut through the morning like a blade. "Mr. Miller," he said, his voice a command and a benediction. "All at once, it is an honor, sir." The silence at the gate was absolute. Not even the wind dared move as General Peters held his salute before the frail figure in the worn suit. The crowd, officers and civilians alike, stared in disbelief. To them, John Miller had been no one, an uninvited old man at the wrong place. But now, with the 4-star general's hand raised in reverence, the ground shifted beneath them all. The lieutenant's voice cracked through the quiet, desperate to reclaim order. "General, sir, I apologize for the disturbance. This man, he was causing a scene. He had no authorization to be here." Peters turned his head just enough to let his eyes fall on the young officer. The salute did not drop, but the weight of that stare was crushing. "He has more authorization to be on this ground than you or I will ever have, Lieutenant." The words landed like thunder. Then the general's gaze lifted, addressing not only the officer, but the entire assembly. His voice rose deep and resonant, carrying across the cemetery. "For those of you who do not know," Peters said, "you see before you not just an old man, not just a civilian. This is John Miller. To history books, that name means nothing. But to the men of the 5th Special Forces Group, to the first operators of Delta, and to the man we lay to rest today, General David Wallace, he was a legend. A legend known by another name, the Shepherd." A gasp rippled through the crowd. The name was whispered on every tongue. Soldiers old enough to have heard the story stiffened as if a ghost had walked into their midst. The general's voice grew stronger. This man went into places that never appeared on any map. He pulled men back from the jaws of death when even their own government had written them off. He was a medic, a pilot, a navigator, and when he had to be a warrior of unmatched ferocity, he wore no rank. He accepted no medals. He said the only reward he needed was seeing his boys come home. Peters took a step closer to John, his voice softening though it carried the same authority. In the spring of 1968, a helicopter carrying 12 Green Berets went down deep in hostile territory. One of the survivors was a young captain named David Wallace. They were outnumbered 10-1, no hope of extraction, but on the 3rd night a single man came for them. He carried half of those men out on his back. That man was John Miller. He is the reason General Wallace lived long enough to serve his country and become the leader we honor today. The general lowered his salute slowly, his eyes never leaving the old man's. He gestured toward the crooked pin on John's lapel. This piece of metal that you mistook for garbage." His words cut like a blade directed at the trembling lieutenant. "It is not garbage. It is a piece of shrapnel from a mortar shell that would have killed Captain Wallace." John Miller threw himself on top of him, taking the blast instead. Wallace later forged that shard into a pin, and he called it the Medal of Shepherds. It is the only one ever made, and it is the highest honor a man like him could ever bestow. The crowd shifted. Pity vanished, replaced by awe. One by one, soldiers began to raise their hands in salute. Privates, sergeants, colonels, every rank lifted in respect to the old man who had walked alone to the gate. The lieutenant's face drained of color, his earlier arrogance burned away by shame. General Peters turned his full attention on him and his guards. His voice dropped low, more dangerous than any shout. "You asked him for his invitation. Every headstone on this hill is his invitation. You demanded to see his medals. His scars are worth more than every ribbon you wear. You stood in the presence of living history and saw nothing but a nuisance. You mistook a titan for a trespasser." The lieutenant swallowed hard. His voice was a whisper now. "Yes, General, you will report to my aide," Peters ordered. "You will be in my office at 0600 tomorrow morning for a lesson in the true meaning of respect. Is that understood?" "Yes, General," came the broken chorus from all 3 men. And in that charged silence, John finally spoke. His hand weathered and gentle touched the general's sleeve. "Michael," he said softly, using the man's first name as only a ghost from the past could. "They're just kids, doing their job the only way they knew how. Let it be." General Peters hesitated, then gave a slow nod. The storm in his eyes eased. John turned his gaze on the lieutenant. There was no anger there, only a steady wisdom. Son, respect isn't in the uniform. It's in your actions. Sometimes the greatest sacrifices are made by those who wear no rank at all. Remember that. The young officer blinked hard, fighting the sting in his eyes. The service resumed, but nothing about it felt the same. General Peters personally escorted John Miller through the gates, past the rows of saluting soldiers, past the stunned silence of officials and mourners. He did not place him at the back among distant acquaintances. He led him straight to the front row, beside General Wallace's grieving family. The family had heard whispers of the shepherd all their lives, bedtime stories wrapped in both awe and mystery. Now the man himself stood before them. Wallace's daughter rose first, her eyes wet, and embraced John as if he had been family all along. His grandsons followed, shaking his hand, whispering thank yous through trembling lips. They wept not just for their loss, but in gratitude for the 50 more years they had been given, with Wallace years stolen back from the jungle by this quiet, unassuming man. John sat through the ceremony without fanfare. He did not cry, nor did he smile. He sat upright, his gaze steady, honoring his friend in silence. When the rifles cracked in the distance and the bugle carried taps across the hills, he closed his eyes, and in the darkness behind them, he saw Wallace again, young, laughing, alive. The fallout from the gate incident came swiftly. General Peters did not seek to destroy the lieutenant and his guards. John would not have wanted that. Instead, Peters ordered their reassignment and mandatory retraining. But he went further. He created a new program for all personnel assigned to sensitive posts, a course in history, humility, and situational judgment. It taught soldiers to see the person, not just the paperwork, to look beyond ribbons and uniforms. The program was named the Miller Protocol, and soon it spread across the armed forces. The story of the old man at the gate became a lesson. Young recruits heard it in classrooms. Seasoned officers repeated it in quiet mess halls. It wasn't a tale about shame. It was a reminder that true valor does not always announce itself. Sometimes it arrives in silence, wearing a threadbare suit. Months passed. The leaves turned and fell. Winter gave way to a pale spring. Life marched on. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, far from the prestige of Arlington, the young lieutenant, now stripped of arrogance and stationed at a modest base, sat alone in a small roadside diner. He stirred his coffee, the weight of his own mistakes still heavy but tempered by reflection. The bell above the door chimed. He looked up. An old man in a simple jacket walked in rainwater sliding from his shoulders. He moved slowly, but with the same quiet steadiness that had haunted the lieutenant's memory. John Miller. The officer froze, heart hammering in his chest. For a long moment he could not move, shame and gratitude warring inside him. Finally he stood, walked over to the counter, and set a $10 bill beside John's cup. "For the coffee, sir," he said softly, his voice thick. He hesitated, then met the old man's calm eyes. "And for the lesson, thank you." John studied him, really looked. He saw the change, the arrogance gone, replaced by humility. A small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth, and he nodded once. "Stay safe, son," he said, voice low but warm, a benediction that needed no more words. The lieutenant swallowed hard, nodded back, and left the diner. John returned to his coffee, staring out at the rain. To anyone else, he was just another old man, but those who knew, even if only a handful understood. Heroes do not always wear uniforms. Sometimes they carry their medals in their hearts and their scars beneath worn jackets. And sometimes when the world forgets, it takes a moment at a gate, a pause in a funeral for history to remember. If this story of quiet valor moved, you share it with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment with your thoughts, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories of the unassuming heroes who walk among us.